après-midi, collègues.
Hello, good afternoon, colleagues. The sound tests have been conducted and everything went well. Before starting, I'd like unanimous consent from the committee
Qui vous a été envoyé un budget
to adopt a budget for our pre-study on C73. Any objections to adopting this budget? Therefore, it is adopted. Ms. Chattel, I'd like to know if we will be meeting next Monday and Wednesday. Only on Monday. Thank you. Not Wednesday. Ms. Collins, can you tell me what topic we will be discussing? We will be talking about the guidelines for the analysts for the report on sustainable finance, among other things. We will likely table some motions as well, or present them. We will be just wrapping things up before the holidays. Ms. Collins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to...
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à confirmer une chose.
I was going to quickly turn it to the original audio while I speak. So, yeah, I just wanted to confirm. I know that we have a meeting scheduled on Monday. I was going to propose a unanimous consent motion today to add an extra 15 minutes so we could tackle a motion that I'd like to table around the net zero accelerator. But if we are meeting on Monday and that we have your commitment that that meeting won't be canceled by you, I'm comfortable doing it later, but just wanted to get that confirmation.
Answer to Madame Chattel, I said, yes, we're having a meeting. And I said that it will be to give drafting instructions to the analysts for the sustainable finance report, but that probably will also be entertaining motions. So I think that covers, I think, your concerns.
Wonderful. So we'll have an opportunity in that meeting to talk about the motions. That sounds great.
Yeah, if people move their motions, I'm sure, you know, that we'll have time for that for sure. Okay, anything else? No? So today we are dealing once again with the Bill C-73. We're doing a pre-study of the bill before it arrives in committee, and we have two panels. The first panel includes the David Suzuki Foundation. The second panel, the Manitoba Wildlife Federation. The first panel includes the David Suzuki Foundation, the Manitoba Wildlife Federation, West Coast Environmental Law Association, and Eco Justice. We'll start with the David Suzuki Foundation. I believe Ms. Gu and Ms. Plotkin, you'll be sharing your 10 minutes. 5 minutes. Sorry, your 5 minutes. Yeah. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you. Good afternoon. The David Suzuki Foundation appreciates the invitation to appear today, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. My name is Lisa Gu. I'm National Policy Manager at DSF, and I'm joined in the room by my colleague Rachel Plotkin, Boreal Project Manager. I'll briefly speak to 3 points, and then I'll hand off to Rachel to complete our opening statement. First, thank you for initiating this pre-study. When Bill C-73 was introduced in June, we called on Parliament to prioritize it on the fall legislative agenda. By this time, we'd hoped to see it referred to committee and reported with strengthening amendments. Instead, the fall came and went, and the bill has yet to even be called for debate. We're very concerned that this important legislation has stalled and encourage the committee to continue this pre-study after the break so you can move quickly to amendments if and hopefully when the bill is finally referred. We also implore all of you to work with your parliamentary colleagues to find a path to enable the second reading debate and vote on C-73 as soon as possible in the new year. My second point is that there has long been broad support from across the political spectrum for Canada's commitments under the Convention on Biodiversity. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the Convention for Canada in 1992. Later, the Global 2020 targets were agreed to under the Harper government. And while the current government deserves credit for Canada's convening role at COP15 in Montreal, where the new 2030 targets were negotiated, they didn't stand alone. I know some of you were there too. It would be appropriate and a powerful statement if Bill C-73 and amendments to strengthen it were supported by all parties, a Team Canada approach to the biodiversity crisis. My third point is that bold targets and accountability legislation are no panacea, and this bill is not a substitute for the many other things that need to be done to halt and reverse nature loss. But a legislative framework for planning, reporting on implementation and results, and continuous improvement is essential to keep progress on track. It will also improve predictability and transparency. I'll leave the remainder of our time to Rachel to speak about why the 2030 nature targets matter.
Go ahead, Ms. Plotkin.
Good afternoon. As Lisa said, my name is Rachel Plotkin, and I'm the Boreal Project Manager at the David Suzuki Foundation, where I work to protect species at risk and maintain and restore healthy forest ecosystems. I'm going to follow Lisa's lead with 3 points of my own, which are set in the context of forest biodiversity. The first is that the current suite of policy and regulatory tools intended to protect biodiversity is not working. This is primarily due to the fact that Canada's approach to protecting nature has often operated with a mitigation framework, which makes sense as an approach in the fight against climate change, but has driven the loss of biodiversity. Under it, protected areas are safe, well, to some extent, from the impacts of resource extraction and development, but outside of protected areas, which is over 70% of the land and water in Canada, harm to nature is continually approved, even if it is mitigated or made less bad, and this leads to ongoing habitat loss and fragmentation, what we call death by 1,000 cuts. An example of how this plays out is boreal woodland caribou, which are threatened with extinction in almost every province and territory in Canada, due primarily to habitat fragmentation caused by forestry and oil and gas extraction activities. The second point is that change can only come about with a strong roadmap outlining how to achieve it. In order to maintain and restore nature, we must develop more effective tools that create limits to the footprints of resource extraction and development activities and clearly demarcate areas of ecological importance. Canada's new nature strategy, which outlines steps to identify degraded areas, support Indigenous leadership, and assess priority areas for restoration, is a start, but it needs legislative backing. My third point is that an effective nature accountability law will bring greater certainty and transparency, which can reward progressive forestry practices in the global marketplace. Clear objectives and mechanisms for reporting on them can help to create confidence in both investors and consumers, which is critically important in industries such as forestry. The global stocktake decision signed by 193 countries last year at COP28 in Dubai includes a 2030 deadline for halting and reversing deforestation and land degradation. Additionally, the EU has adopted a deforestation regulation prohibiting trade tied to deforestation and forest degradation. This means preventing forest degradation is critical to the success of the Canadian forestry industry in the global forum. In Canada, we're still largely stuck in the mitigation framework, limiting damage on a site-by-site basis while overall forest degradation remains the trend. The maintenance and restoration of biodiversity is this generation's collective responsibility. If we are to achieve it, we need a roadmap to get there, with targets, timelines, policies, and clearly identified leaders. Because, despite good intentions, our stumbling to date has been grossly insufficient to halt and reverse the loss of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Plotkin. We'll go now to the Manitoba Wildlife Federation. We have with us Chris Held, Senior Policy Advisor. Go ahead, Mr. Held, with your opening statement.
Thank you for the opportunity and to be a witness. And to start with, I'll provide a little bit of background. The Manitoba Wildlife Federation is the oldest and largest conservation organization in Manitoba. We are over 80 years old and represent conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoor enthusiasts. Our members are from all walks of life and all ethnicities. Our membership shares in a deep passion for the protection of our environment and believes strongly that all of our country's resources are a shared resource, and that it doesn't matter what that resource is, be it water, trees, wildlife, minerals, or fish. They belong to all Canadians, regardless of economic stature or ethnicity. We are also adamant that these precious resources must be managed and harvested in a sustainable manner. That's a bit of background. My specific comments on Bill C-73. We feel strongly that the federal government is implementing a UN-driven environmental targets, which were committed to without consultation with the provinces, landowners, resource users who manage and enjoy these public spaces. We believe this bill provides the minister with a blank check to implement changes without any further parliamentary oversight. We feel this bill uses words of symbolism that sound great on paper, but fall short on details and are devoid of measurable outcomes. We feel this bill has the federal government overreaching into provincial jurisdiction. This bill talks about collaboration numerous times, but in fact it provides the federal minister with wide discretion to consult, or if he chooses not to, with the province, municipal governments, private landowners, and resource users, including hunters and anglers. This bill closely mirrors other federal government United Nations initiatives like the Indigenous Protected Areas and Ecological Corridors. It provides the authority for large-scale set-aside of public lands, our country's shared resources, and a delegation of control and management of access to Crown lands to unelected management authorities. Some Manitoba-specific examples of what I've just described are the federal government pushing the IPAs and ecological corridors without consultation with landowners, the provincial government, municipal governments, or grassroots organizations like ours. With the IPAs, we've seen the federal government deputize Parks Canada begin implementation of the Seal River Indigenous Protected Area in northern Manitoba. This large tract of Crown land consists of an area the size of the province of Nova Scotia. This IPA is the first of 9 proposed for Manitoba, and that has received initial federal funding from the $600 million federal allotment. The implementation of this IPA and the ecological corridors designed to connect the IPAs are being forced through without proper consultation, and they do not have widespread support as stated. Common sense would dictate that these initiatives are bound to fail in meeting their goals without full consultation of all invested stakeholders. How can we as a society consider restricting access to Crown resources, implement management practices on private land without including the farmers, the hunters, and the anglers who live in these areas and are the true champions in protecting our precious natural resources? We urge this committee and the federal government to rethink this top-down, UN-driven approach, stop delegating control over these lands to unelected management boards, and develop a made-in-Canada approach that engages input from all the provinces and all Canadians who cherish our outdoor spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Held. We'll go now to West Coast Environmental Law. Anna Johnston, staff lawyer.
Good afternoon. Many thanks to the chair and to the members of this committee for inviting me to come and speak about this important bill. I am a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, where my expertise focuses on constitutional law, biodiversity, climate, and impact assessment law. I've been working closely on Bill C-73 with my colleagues Josh Ginsberg and Stephen Hazel from EcoJustice and Greenpeace, who are also appearing before you today. We've submitted a joint brief recommending proposed amendments, and we've divided up our speaking notes so that we can be most efficient and effective for you this evening. I'm going to focus my remarks on why we and nature need a strong nature accountability law. I was deeply involved in the development and implementation of the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which I like to call SNEEZY after its acronym, and so have firsthand experience in how accountability legislation can help drive government ambition and transparency in setting and meeting nature targets, environmental targets. And so my remarks are based primarily on what we've learned from SNEEZY and that we can apply to Bill C-73. Put simply, as it has with climate, Canada has a long history of talking a big talk on nature and then failing to walk the walk. We've been a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, since 1993, and as required by the Convention in 1995, we published a national biodiversity strategy that set out a framework for protecting nature. In 2010, we agreed to the Aichi targets, a set of 5 strategic goals and 20 targets aimed at addressing challenges in the implementation of the CBD. We also have a federal sustainable development strategy that includes goals like protecting and recovering species and conserving biodiversity, and myriad laws aimed at protecting nature, like the Species at Risk Act, the Fisheries Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act. And yet, as our colleagues from the David Suzuki Foundation pointed out, our biodiversity is in a free fall. Species continue to decline at alarming rates, habitat continues to degrade and fragment, and invasive species and pollution continue to accumulate, with climate change exacerbating these harms. I would argue that it's been a lack of accountability for setting and meeting nature goals that is why Canada's biodiversity has declined at this rate despite all of our international and domestic laws and instruments. While the CBD requires Canada to submit national biodiversity plans and progress reports, there's nothing actually preventing it from instead producing glossy brochures instead of detailed and credible documents. And what the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act has taught us is that accountability legislation can help drive ambition in setting domestic targets and make plans for meeting those targets credible and ensure honest reporting on progress. Before SNEEZI was enacted, Canada's 2030 climate target was 30%, which was far below what experts said was Canada's obligation under the Paris Agreement, and its climate plan lacked any kind of details that would be necessary to know if we were going to meet even that weak target. After SNEEZI came into force, the government set a more ambitious target of 40 to 45% and established a new and more detailed plan for how it would achieve those reductions. Last December, its first progress report showed that since the Act has been enacted, we have increased our ambition and are more closely on track to meeting our climate goals. Bill C-73 could help do the same for nature, but not, unfortunately, as it's currently drafted. It is so light on detail that it more closely resembles one of those glossy brochures that we're trying to avoid than true accountability legislation. So to live up to its promise, we think that Bill C-73 needs to do 6 things. First, it needs to require the minister to set national nature targets so that we know what direction we're trying to go. It also needs to be more prescriptive about the contents of plans and reports so that we have a roadmap for meeting those targets and honesty about whether we're on course. It needs to ensure that the Nature Advisory Committee has the mandate, expertise, and resources it needs to provide independent advice. It should enshrine a biodiversity shield so that federal decisions don't undermine our ability to meet our nature targets. It should require periodic reviews by the Sustainability Commissioner, and it should ensure respect for Indigenous rights, knowledge, and law in all steps and decisions taken under it. So I'll conclude my remarks there. Would be happy to answer any questions. And as I mentioned, my colleagues Josh Ginsberg and Stephen Hazel will go into more details on these recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Johnston. We go now to Joshua Ginsberg from EcoJustice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members. Thank you for initiating the pre-study of this important piece of legislation, and thank you also for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss our proposals to improve Bill C-73. I'm a lawyer at EcoJustice, and I also direct the environmental clinical program at the University of Ottawa. I specialize in constitutional, administrative, and environmental law. Bill C-73 is welcome progress for nature. Canada contains a huge part of the natural world, which we are responsible for safeguarding. It has approximately 24% of the world's boreal forests, about 25% of the world's temperate forests. Its 1.5 million square kilometers of wetlands make up about 25% of the entire world's total. Canada also has the world's longest coastline, 2 million lakes, and the 3rd largest area of glaciers in the world. All of that is facing decline at rates unprecedented in human history. Canada needs a national law to coordinate and implement its commitments to halt and reverse nature loss made in the landmark global meeting in Montreal in 2022. I am concerned, however, that the Nature Accountability Act, as presently drafted, is weaker than its counterparts in other jurisdictions, notably the United Kingdom, and even weaker than its companion legislation in Canada concerning climate, which is the Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act. Unlike those two laws, the NAA as currently drafted does not require that the government set any target or end goal for biodiversity. There is no clear purpose in the law for the planning and the reporting that it requires. It's kind of like outfitting a ship for an ocean voyage, but not setting a destination. You're likely to get lost or go in circles. With amendments to strengthen it, though, the NAA will help Canada chart a course to harmony with nature by 2050. Our proposed amendments strengthen the NAA by directing the government to set national targets for nature and make detailed plans to meet them. This is very much like the UK legislation, which incorporates goals and targets directly into its regulations, including targets to reduce the risk of extinction and restore and create wildlife-rich habitat. The targets there are accompanied by detailed reporting obligations to ensure accountability. Now, national targets are required for laws like this one that implement global commitments, like the Paris Agreement for Climate and the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed in Montreal. And that's for two reasons. First, Canada has a dualist system, which means that international agreements have no force here until Parliament, you, says they do. A law means that Canada has an obligation to act and also shows the world that we are serious about our nature commitments. Second, these agreements set a broad global ambition, with each country left autonomously to determine what they will do within their own borders to contribute. Specifying those contributions in law makes government accountable for achieving them. So these targets are very much in response to the commitments that we've made internationally, but they are a made-in-Canada approach. We have not met past nature commitments. The lack of a legal basis for those commitments was a key reason for that. The independent auditor found that the reason for failure was a lack of strong national leadership, including an integrated national approach that coordinates actions, tracks progress, and makes the required corrections. And that is what the NAA, with our suggested amendments, will accomplish. I want to say one word about jurisdiction, because it was raised already by my fellow panelist here. The federal government has an important role in protecting nature, and so do provinces and Indigenous nations. The jurisdiction of all governments must be respected, and they must be enabled to do everything within their power to protect the natural world. And it's for that reason that our proposed definition of national targets distinguishes between targets that are within federal jurisdiction to achieve and targets which are national in nature, which the federal government would necessarily seek to cooperate with provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples. And we emphasize that Indigenous rights and jurisdiction must be respected and prioritized in target setting. So in our brief accompanying our remarks, we've provided for you detailed suggestions for amendments to enable target setting, to improve reporting requirements so that the public gets a full picture of the progress being made towards those targets, and to ensure independent oversight and a whole-of-government approach to nature. I would be very happy to answer any questions about those suggestions, and let me close by saying that we again thank the committee for this important work and urge it to support Bill C-73 and to endorse our amendments to make it even more effective.
Thank you. We'll go to questions. Mr. Leslie for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with a fairly straightforward yes or no answer, and I'll start right to left, because I'd like to hear all of your views on this. Recently, Minister Guilbeault was sitting in one of those very chairs, and he gave himself a very aggressive pat on the back for achieving the Climate Scorecard 2024 Government Climate Leadership Award. You were all, frankly, very critical of the achievements of him as a minister and of this government. Do you believe that the government is living up to the promises that they have made and are in fact achieving the results that they have promised Canadians in terms of biodiversity loss reduction and emissions reduction? So I'll start with Ms. Johnson and go across.
You're starting with the easy questions, eh? I think that this government has made admirable progress on the environment in general and specifically on climate.
Oh, so thank you.
Thank you for the question. No government of any stripe has fully met any biodiversity targets for which they've committed. That's why we do applaud the government for bringing forward this bill, but which
Further
is
from
flawed.
a yes, no.
I'm sorry?
I only get to say no or yes, I don't get to elaborate.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
No.
Go ahead, Mr.
no.
Plug.
From Mr. Van Koerden.
Thanks. Expert witnesses come to this committee to provide their expertise, not to be directed as to how to answer
It's my
questions.
time, Adam.
Mr. Leslie's time, I would say to the witnesses, you know, you're under no obligation to give a binary answer.
I
mean,
am. I don't lie to committee.
It's, you know, and sometimes things are very complex. But anyways, Mr. Leslie's right to ask you to answer yes or no, but you're under no obligation to
So I'm gonna
do that.
elaborate then if I'm not under no obligation.
Well, I
so-
mean, if Mr. Leslie doesn't want you to
Yes, that would
elaborate,
be
wants
great.
wants to ask another question, then it's his time as well. So,
Okay.
So we'll go back. I'll set the. Pardon? He has
9 minutes.
4.5 minutes. Yeah, 4.5 minutes. I'm just.
Okay, thank you.
So my answer is no, and I actually believe the path they're on is going to create further division, and net loss is going to increase. So what we're seeing on the landscape is, sorry, I got
I
cut
want
off
to be
again.
equal
so-
opportunity here. Go
There we
ahead,
go.
Ms. Plotkin.
I would say that they're taking steps, but it's a complicated political landscape working with the provinces and with all the different parties.
Thank you. Mr. Heald, you mentioned the word blank check, which I find to be fairly accurate, particularly in terms of who the minister, in this case Minister Guilbeault, can appoint to the advisory panel when making some of these biodiversity decisions. To me, this is quite concerning because who you put on that advisory board actually really matters. So I want to ask, you've read the legislation, I assume? Are anglers mentioned in it?
No, sir.
Are hunters mentioned in it?
No, sir.
Are farmers?
No, sir.
Are landowners, broadly speaking?
No, sir.
Are trappers?
No, sir.
What an odd neglection of a whole bunch of people that live, work, and play on the land. Who do you think might be put on this board?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Our organization's 80 years old. We're doing biodiversity pilot projects in our province, and we don't know about any of these projects that are coming down, these bills. We're learning about it second and third hand, so that's why you're on the wrong path. The way this is going, we're on the wrong path. So we exclude landowners, we exclude hunters and anglers. You're going to create that division, and it's not going to work.
Do you think that was on purpose?
100%.
I agree. I don't trust this minister, and I think it's very intentional that he is excluding the people that literally live, work, and play on the land, the people that I represent here. And it's appalling. And I think it goes to show the type of decision-making and how it comes to be. The attempt here at the end of the day is to carve off 30% of the land mass in Canada, which prevents access to whether it be existing private landowners, hunters, anglers, from having the access necessary to participate in these traditional heritage activities, which is, as Manitoba Wildlife Federation, obviously who you represent. How do we make sure that that understanding of the land and those folks are represented and respected in this legislation?
They have to be part of the legislation. They have to be legislated to be part of it. Everybody's going to be at the table. You can't divide based on ethnicity or stature or geographic areas. Everybody should be at the table when these bills are being created. So,
what would your perspective be if you could explain to me the people that you represent? How do they view biodiversity, and what do they do to enhance it?
they're passionate about it. I live on 20 acres and manage it for biodiversity. So we are running pilot projects trying to create where management areas have been set aside with no management techniques, and we're seeing the biodiversity loss because there's no more management, no more controlled burning, no more grazing. So there is another train of thought. You can't just set aside large tracts of land and expect biodiversity to happen on its own. It needs to be managed. You have to replicate fires. You have to replicate grazing. You need those disturbances on the landscape to have biodiversity. So our organizations are on a lot different track than what we're being represented.
No, that sounds like a viewpoint of somebody that actually lives, works, and plays in the land, not in an ivory tower law office. If we give you $1 million to enhance biodiversity, how would you spend it versus how I think others might?
You have to meet with the landowners, first of all. You can't make decisions in Ottawa or Geneva or somewhere else without speaking to the landowners. So the landowners are the true stewards. They're there every single day. Hunters and anglers are on the landscape every single day. They see biodiversity loss. They're the greatest protectors of nature. So
one of the things that really bothered me when this government came into power in 2015, I used to work for a fellow named Robert Sopak, one of the strongest, most passionate conservationists in the country. And I would say he single-handedly saved more fish through his development of the Recreational Fisheries Conservation Partnership Program, which I assume your members or individuals took part in. And that was canceled
Well,
for no reason.
We're out
Could you
of time.
explain to me your understanding of the program?
We're out of time, unfortunately. And yeah, it was a good MP, Mr. Soba. We'll go now to Mr. Shafkat. No, Mr. Ali, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question is to Mr. Ginsburg. Halting and reversing biodiversity loss is one of the great challenges of our time. But if we get it right, the transition to a nature-positive Canada will have profoundly positive impacts on our collective well-being, economic prosperity, and quality of life now and into the future. Can you tell the members why Bill C-73 is crucial and why must it pass?
Thank you for the question. It is absolutely crucial that if we are aiming for the end state that you described, which I completely agree with, we have to carefully plan and make sure that we understand the steps to get there. In the past, we have not done that, and while individual progress may have been helpful, we have not planned broadly or coherently in order to achieve our desired end state. That's why we need what I've described as a made-in-Canada plan, respecting and implementing our international agreements, but adapting them for the Canadian scene. Let me say, just in response to the exchange with my co-panelist here, just to make sure we're not creating division where none exists, I don't say, and none of our agreements say, that conservation and that end state that you described precludes the kind of activities that the members of my co-panelist group here enjoy and promote. In fact, I think those people should be at the table. Nothing in the bill precludes that, and that's part of what a made-in-Canada approach means.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. This bill is currently at a second reading in the House of Commons. Do you think that this bill should get expedited in the House of Commons at second reading?
Absolutely. Nature cannot wait.
Thank you. My next question to Anna, Ms. Anna Johnston. Bill C-73 is also known to be a sister bill to the Canadian Net Zero Emission Accountability Act, C-12, showing transparency to Canadians and keeping governments to account is important. Why does Canada need a Nature Accountability Act?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So one of the problems that the barriers to effective biodiversity protection in Canada has been, I mentioned that all of these international instruments that we're a party to and these myriad federal laws and programs and regulations, there's no one unifying place where we see whether and how they're working together and then what gaps there are. And so an effective Bill C-73, Nature Accountability Law, would be the place, once we get that detail fleshed out in what has to be in national biodiversity strategies and action plans, then we're able to have a comprehensive picture of what we have in place to protect nature, what are the main drivers of biodiversity loss that we have to contend with, and also, like I said, what are the gaps that need to be filled. We have all of these different fragments, but right now we don't have that one holding place to see how they're all working together and whether we need additional resources to protect nature. So that's what we really see that this bill can do.
Great, thank you. How much time do I have, Chair?
2 minutes.
Okay. And I like to hear from you, from both of you, on Canada's nature strategy, which was released in June 2024. Can you tell us about it, and why does it tie with this bill, and why it is so important?
Maybe I'll just
Yes.
begin and say, so under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and as would be prescribed by Bill C-73, the federal government has to produce biodiversity strategies and action plans. And what we've seen lacking to date has been enough detail for those strategies and plans to actually provide us, as I called it earlier, the roadmap that we need. The 2030 Nature Strategy is much more detailed in terms of a strategy, but you'll notice in the title, it's just the 2030 Nature Strategy. We don't yet have the accompanying action plan. And so what I see our proposed amendments doing, since they prescribe the actual contents of strategies and plans, is that it would require the federal government to then build onto this fairly strong 2030 strategy and to come up with the action plan for how we're actually going to put that strategy into action.
Thank you. You wanted to add something?
Thank you. I'll just add that the government strategy around the international targets does recognize the key drivers of biodiversity loss, the scale and urgency of the crisis in Canada, and the need for transformative change and a whole of government approach. We would like to see those drivers actually put into law so that we can be accountable for them, to understand what are the important drivers, where do we want to be, and where are we now? What do we need to do to get there?
Thank you.
That's the key.
Thanks very much. Madame Posé, c'est à vous la parole.
Ms. Posé. Hello, everyone. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I would have liked to be there with you, but if you'd want to avoid any germs, it would be best for me to stay at my office. Mr. Ginsburg, of course, we think that the government can do what it wants, and it's just political. But the act might indeed protect biodiversity and nature. We have been demanding from the government that they stop making decisions that are incompatible with its own biodiversity-based decisions. So, you know, there's a lot of beautiful speeches, and of course I will be talking about what we learned earlier this week with regards to the coastal mine. The president of the Impact Evaluation Project, that there was a development project of 630 hectares would go ahead without any evaluation. So how can we do that without an impact assessment? This might be the biggest carbon mine in the history of Canada. So would this kind of decision regarding this mine not counteract the benefits of the act? We wouldn't be able to reach our goals this way. Thank you for the question. You are right. A project like that one would have a big impact on biodiversity, especially on fisheries and other species. In other parts of the world, a big project such as Vista would have to be evaluated. Here's what I've observed, that the laws with regards to responsibility towards nature do not have regulatory decisions such as this one. That is not their goal. The goal is to see if these decisions line up with Canada's goals. Right now, there is no evaluation method to see if a regulatory decision will undermine our objective for nature, or environmental objectives, rather. That is why we need this act for biodiversity. That is one of our suggestions, or rather, we need a shield. The impact of projects such as Vista must be taken into consideration, as they might have a impact on diversity. This must be taken into consideration by evaluating the actual project. Thank you, Mr. Ginsburg. You had a lot of things to share, and so I let you share those. Of course, we're here talking about biodiversity, talking about decisions that might really go against what we're trying to do here. The Act requires national reports to be published and progress reports. For example, if we're attaining any of the objectives we have set, as well as other information that the minister and department might think is relevant. Do you think that this information is enough? Do you think that we should strengthen it? And if there should be more requirements, what would you include for these reports? Thank you. We have to do more with regards to the national goals. We don't have any national goals right now. They would ensure that the Canadian government would take into consideration all natural threats and would engage all of the provinces and Indigenous nations. The targets must be specific. They must line up with the decisions made at the conference in Montreal. We recommend that the report explains the main threats to biodiversity. Inaudible. Right now, the Act only has biodiversity targets from the Montreal Accord. Which elements could the federal government expand on? For example, international targets. There are many targets and impacts on biodiversity that are explained. In the international biodiversity frameworks. I'll say this in English.
Species distribution, species extinction risk, habitat quality and extent, ecosystem integrity, connectivity, and resilience. These are all things that are taken into account in our international commitments, but not currently reflected in the law.
Merci. On a dépassé le temps. Je vous
Thank you. We've gone over time. Mr. Chair, I would just like to thank Mr. Ginsburg for everything that he's done to answer in French and his efforts. I was going to say the same thing. I gave him a bit of extra time because he made some great efforts to express himself in French.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you so much to all of the witnesses for being here and for all of your work when it comes to promoting biodiversity, protecting nature. I have a number of questions, and maybe I'll pick up a little bit where Madame Posey left off around targets. Mr. Ginsberg, can you start by telling us a little bit about the targets that you're proposing and how they are connected to the Global Biodiversity Framework?
Certainly. So the GBF, as I explained perhaps rather haltingly in French now, does set out a number of interim targets to 2030, which are global in nature. But what that actually means for Canada is unclear. As I said in my opening remarks, that's left for each individual signatory to the treaty to define. And so we say that we should take those global lists and define them.
If I can just quickly. That's amazing. And can you talk about just why it's so important to have guidance in this law for target setting?
So we see it in the international examples as well. We won't get to the end state if we don't clearly state in the law what is required to get there. That's what accountability means. Parliament expressing the desire to get to a certain end state and then prescribing what the government must do in order to show that it is getting there. In the UK, the environmental targets for biodiversity, these are regulations made under the Environment Act 2021, set very detailed targets for species recovery, for lowering extinction risk, for species abundance, and for habitat restoration and creation. We don't want to be a laggard in this area. That is the international best practice that we should follow.
Great. And why is it important for those targets to be set for milestone years?
That's already our practice in the Net Zero Act, which we've mentioned. The minister there is required to set a national greenhouse gas emissions target for each milestone year with a view to achieving that defined target. It's a very important accountability measure. It would be incoherent to take a different approach with respect to biodiversity, and it might actually be even more important with respect to biodiversity because of the complexity of nature reporting. We're dealing with many indicators, not just one. We have to make sure that we are on track, and if we're not, that we are correcting course in a timely way to achieve success. That's why we need time-bound indicators.
Great. And then maybe turning to Ms. Johnson, is there anything you want to add about targets, without tangible, quantifiable targets? It's hard to see how this bill would enforce any accountability. And so do you want to expand at all on what Mr. Ginsberg said, especially about the repercussions the government could face if they fail to meet their targets?
Yeah, thanks for letting me expand on this. So first I'd say, while climate change is an incredibly difficult challenge, as we all know, it's actually comparatively much more simple to at least set targets for than biodiversity. There are so many facets to biodiversity. It's such a complicated subject. That's why we're proposing in our amendments that the Act be prescriptive about the areas that the government has to consider when it's setting targets, because there are, as we've both alluded to, so many drivers of biodiversity decline. And then when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about species, habitat, connectivity, ecosystems. And so we need to have multiple targets so that we're attacking all of the root causes of nature loss and also making sure that we're protecting all the values. And targets are important because they tell us where we ought to be. So how are we going to measure our progress if we don't have the signposts along the way? When we talk about accountability, it's the same as under the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. We're not so much talking about legal accountability, because also federalism and the provinces have a huge role to play in protecting nature. We're not thinking that under this
Ms.
act—
Johnson, I'm just going to jump in just because I'm running short on time, and I do want to get a couple of questions into some of the other witnesses. Maybe turning to Ms. Gu, if you can either, expand on the importance of GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, but also maybe tie in a little bit about the importance of government funding when it comes to meeting these goals.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, just to build on what we offered in our opening statement, this death by 1,000 cuts, as my colleague stated, this death by 1,000 cuts problem is really an apt characterization of one of the greatest failings in Canada's current approach to protecting nature, protecting biodiversity. It's literally often a case of missing the forest for the trees. So, while we have these, yes, imperfect processes for assessing, mitigating damage from individual on a case-by-case basis, what we see is that one step forward in one area is undermined by several steps back somewhere else. So that's the turning point that the new global biodiversity framework targets offer us, is an opportunity to see the whole, to see how to drive progress towards an overall result. But to get there, we need, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, clear guideposts and transparency to know how we're doing, to track our progress.
Very much. Thank you. We're really short for time, so for the second round, I'm going to make it 2 minutes each. Yeah, because unless you want to extend the meeting today, but it says 2 minutes each. So basically, time for a good question, that packs a lot of punch. So we'll start with Mr. Mazier.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Heel, this will be for you. The Liberals have introduced a national program for ecological corridors without consulting landowners or land users. The government claimed that this program was needed to connect protected areas. However, there are many valid concerns that this is a backdoor attempt to restrict land use and access. I personally have concerns with the program, especially because it's run by Parks Canada. Does your organization have any concerns with the national program for ecological corridors that this committee should be aware of?
For sure. I mean, it's fitting into the same mold. We're not consulting with people that live and breathe on the ground. We are making decisions in Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver. We're not talking to. So that announcement, again, we're the oldest conservation organization in Manitoba. We were not consulted. We're not invited to the announcement. Neither were the landowners. Only the groups that support the Liberal, the federal government's direction. So we are being excluded. So we do have concerns because we know where it's going to lead to. So without having a seat at the table and being part of the discussions, of course we have concerns. So.
Do you have any reason to believe that the government's ecological corridor program is an attempt to restrict land use and land access?
For sure. When you turn management over to Parks Canada or Indigenous protected areas or different control mechanisms that are not elected officials, how is there any accountability? So we are being excluded. Hunters, fishers, trappers, anglers, the true conservationists on the ground are being excluded from any of these discussions.
The most vocal supporters of Bill C-73 appear to be environmental activist groups that don't support land use or development. I think of organizations like EcoJustice, the David Suzuki Foundation, and Greenpeace. Do you have anything to say about this?
I mean, again, they don't support sustainable use of the resource, so they don't support hunting and fishing by licensed hunters or anglers. So, of course, we have a concern. The government is only leaning on one side of the equation. They're not taking everybody's, feelings and thoughts into account. So, of course.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to, I know the time is short, so Ms. Gu, I'd like to direct my question to you. Because this bill, well, perhaps doesn't go far enough in terms of some of the goal setting, has a lot of really important things in it, and I think you would agree. And I'm just wondering about the trade-off between getting this bill through and putting in all of these different amendments. And in particular, when you're talking about setting the goals or the specific goals, my feeling is it will take a lot of consultation. And as you know, the accountability part, the federal government has been having difficulty delivering on the targets because obviously we have a multi-jurisdictional government and we do not have jurisdiction over many things. So if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of getting this act through now and I suppose how how we can address perhaps some of the things that you've raised after it passes. Is that possible, and is it that important to get this done?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I might invite my co-panelist, Joshua Ginsberg, to add on the specific issue of the amendments he's suggesting around strengthening the target setting portion of the bill. I fully sympathize with the dilemma in front of you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. However, I must respectfully reject the premise of the question. I do dare to hope that both are possible. As I stated in my opening comments, we are asking MPs, we're asking Parliament to expedite the second reading debate and vote on this bill so that it can come to committee for strengthening amendments. And I hope that the committee will work together to find a path forward that enables a stronger version of this legislation to pass.
Thank you. Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey? My questions will be for Ms. Johnston. In your opening remarks, you said that the government makes these great speeches in favor of nature but doesn't really do much. You said that this act did not provide enough accountability. So I'd like to ask about investments and money. Should there not be more funding to protect nature? Minister Freeland said is going to present her budget. Her fall supplementary update, do you think that on Monday there will be funds allocated to protecting nature?
I'm sorry, I can't answer in French. But I can't speak to what the government will do next week, but I certainly hope that the fall economic statement will include a commitment to a renewal of nature funding, because you're right, it's absolutely critical that there is the money to implement the important protections that we hope to achieve for nature.
How important is it to have a consulting committee, and what would make it more efficient?
The advisory committee is absolutely critical. We need to get that independent expert advice before the federal government, and also to make sure that it's in front of the public. That's part of one of the cornerstones of accountability, is being able to compare what the government is doing against what experts are saying needs to be done. And to make sure that it's efficient, I think, and effective, when we look at the example of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada under the Species at Risk Act, what has made it really effective is its ability to set its own terms of reference.
Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to try and squeeze in two questions. So the first is a yes or no question to each panelist. You can say yes, no, or pass. Between 2020 and 2023, the percentage of Canadian areas designated as protected or covered by other effective conservation measures increased just 1%, so 12.5 to 13.6. This raises serious concerns. Do you think that Canada is on track to meet its nature commitments? And maybe start with Ms. Gu.
No, and that's why we need this bill.
Okay, great. And then in the room, if Chair, you can indicate the next.
The next what? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Ginsberg, do you want to go next?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mr. Ginsberg. Yeah.
This bill will help.
Ms. Johnston, I guess.
I echo what Mr. Ginsberg said.
And just in the interest of time, if the folks can say yes or no.
No, I will. No, because we're on the wrong direction.
Okay.
The next question I will try and squeeze into 1 minute, but I'm really interested in the biodiversity shield. This is a proposal that you folks have, that a number of people have put forward. Whoever wants to jump in, do you want to explain to the committee the importance of a biodiversity shield?
Maybe I can do that by giving an example. So about a year ago, the federal government approved the Cedar LNG facility in British Columbia, despite the fact that it is going to impact the critical habitat of the marbled murrelet. species at risk, which highlights exactly why we need to ensure that biodiversity considerations are baked into federal decision making. Because when we see in practice the federal government approving the further erosion of species at risk critical habitat, in my view, it shows clearly the need for this kind of biodiversity shield.
Thank you.
For two, okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with Mr. Heald from the Manitoba Wildlife Federation. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Kivalliq hydrofiber link is a major project to connect Manitoba hydro transmission lines to communities in Nunavut so they can stop burning diesel. This project will also include fiber optic cables so people in Nunavut can enjoy high-speed internet access. Can you speak to the effects of this legislation on projects such as that, given that it includes 1,200 kilometers of transmission lines in northern Manitoba?
It's a huge concern for our organization and for First Nations and taxpayers of Manitoba. That's a major link, and if you can't have industrial development in any means, or mining or forestry, it can handicap future generations. So we feel there's better ways to make those protected areas through wildlife management areas that can be permitted for certain issues like this, and but it is a handicapping thing. If you put this in and put it under Parks Canada control, we're turning over the decision making to Parks Canada. So that's a big concern for Manitobans. So.
And to date, how much consultation are you aware of with agriculture producers in your province or in Western Canada with respect to Bill C-73?
None that I'm aware of.
None that you're aware of. Okay. Why do you suppose these groups have been ignored?
All our national partners from each province, none of us have been consulted on this whatsoever. So the Indigenous protected area in the Seal River area alone, Parks Canada opened a public consultation during the summer holidays and has held just town halls in areas that support it. And we've been excluded. When members have asked to attend, we're not allowed to attend. So that's where we're at right now.
And so are producers even aware that this legislation exists?
No. We just learned about the ecological corridors maybe less than a month ago.
Thanks very much. Mr. Vancouver, 2 minutes.
Sorry, I'd like to ask for clarification. Did you just find out, Mr. Heald, that there's an ecological corridors program a month ago?
We just learned about it.
Okay, well, we made an announcement in my riding more than 2 years ago about the ecological corridors project. It's fantastically popular with conservationists, with land use owners. It has absolutely no implications on landowners. First of all, it's very popular and it's been around for a long time. So I'm surprised that as a conservationist you haven't heard about it.
Yeah, no, we haven't been consulted or talked to about this at all. The announcements that Terry Duguid did, they were not. Nobody was invited. It was outside the circle. So.
Okay, thanks. To the best of your knowledge, Mr. Ginsburg, would this legislation have an impact on landowners, private land?
It would not.
Ms. Johnston?
No, it has no substantive prohibitions or requirement. It would no effect. It's a process law.
Right, and when land is protected for biodiversity protection, it can still be accessed for recreation and certainly even for hunting. Is that correct, Ms. Plotkin? I can see you nodding.
That is correct in most protected areas.
Yeah, Canada's a large country with a lot of great open space and wonderful conservation areas, and I think one of the least controversial issues is that we preserve it and save it and make sure that it's here for generations to come. I'm a big fan of the outdoors, and I thank all four of you for coming and helping us strengthen this legislation. I probably have less than 1 minute left. Ms. Johnston, if you could make one recommendation in closing, one way to strengthen this legislation, what would you do?
Probably most critically, I'd beef up the requirements around the ENVI SAPs, the biodiversity strategies, action plans, and reports, because that's really where we are able to see what the federal government is planning to do to protect nature.
Well, with my remaining 10 seconds, I'd just like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank all of you for contributing today. You do have a seat at the table because you are at the table. You are contributing to better legislation today. And
thank you very much. This brings our panel to an end. We'll stop briefly. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion. I think the 2-minute system worked very well. People were really focused, Okay, thanks again. It was all very interesting. Assembly of First Nations Yukon Region, BC Wildlife Federation, Greenpeace Canada, and Nature Canada. We'll start with the Assembly of First Nations Yukon Region, and I believe it's the Regional Chief, Chloe Adamek, who will be speaking. Is that correct? Chief Adamek is. So the floor is yours, Chief, for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
So I'm hoping the timing then starts now, Mr. Chair.
Yes, it starts right now.
Dunje Ayenji Kluanman Uye, Dachlawedi Ayachat, Luanman Kaiiche. Ganach Chish Algonquin Kwan, Ganach Chish. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with, of course, this important committee as you work through the precursors with respect to Bill C-73. In terms of my remarks today, I'm going to be very specific around recommendations for amendments as we view from a First Nation lens that this bill is critically important to ensure that there is accountability mechanisms in place with respect to implementation. Bill C-73 is an important component of Canada's plan to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. However, as introduced, the body requires a few changes to do so. Firstly, it requires more commitments within the bill, including legislation that targets achievement rather than just reporting on progress, and I'll give a few examples to that shortly. Requires a study of Canadian legislation, policies, programs, and subsidies harmful to biodiversity, and to create a plan to address them. And lastly, legislate authority, responsibility, and capacity to the Ministerial Advisory Committee, as well as ensuring that there is specific representation from First Nation individuals. Now, I say this specifically as the Métis and Inuit, I'm assuming will have a chance to speak with you regarding their amendments, but from a First Nation perspective, we require a member on this committee. I can speak to the importance of this as I did serve on Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body and ensuring that Indigenous voices are represented at all levels where decisions and or advice related to the land, environment, water, of course, and biodiversity is absolutely critical from a rights-based approach. The stronger commitments within this bill require ministers to be responsible for each target, to create accountability for lack of progress on missed targets, which is currently not included, identifying key drivers for biodiversity loss. A critical component to success of this bill and the ENVI SAP is the requirement for a process to identify legislation, policies, and programming, including subsidies, which drive biodiversity loss. Without a process like this and actions on findings, Canada is setting conservation targets while simultaneously working against these targets and supporting further degradation of biodiversity. This study should identify legislation, programs, policies, and subsidies which harm biodiversity and identify the ministers responsible, recommend measures to reduce and eliminate these mechanisms, and report on progress via national reports. Lastly, as mentioned, as a guidance for a mechanism on Canada's success in halting and reversing biodiversity loss, the advisory committee must be appropriately funded and equipped. It requires the importance of incorporating traditional knowledge and Western science to advise on conservation. And as mentioned, the Indigenous knowledge must come directly from Indigenous knowledge holders. As such, this advisory body must ensure that there is a rights-based lens. To enable this bill, it must authorize the committee to review and advise on elements related to Canada achieving biodiversity outcomes and must commit appropriate and sustainable resources to this work. In terms of a reflection that I'll share with the committee, it goes like this. I come from Kluane First Nation. You can Google Kluane National Park. Our lake has gone down by 10 feet in the last 10 years. The ways in which our fish are growing has changed. The mass amounts of wolves that we see in our territory have impacted the way in which we hunt moose and caribou. If we don't put into plan an action on accountability with respect to this bill, then we're going to be looking to these species, we're going to be observing, we're going to be looking at biodiversity, but there's going to be no accountability on the ways in which some of the work is going to be actually implemented and how it will be actually reviewed in terms of data. And so this is where we do require some of the amendments I have suggested, but specifically from a rights-based approach, you've got to include First Nations. This bill, in our view, while geopolitically it is a very partisan environment, here in Canada it is a very partisan environment, we view this bill as something that every single party should be getting behind because we've got to be accountable. There's no way in moving forward without ensuring that we're actually tracking what it is that we're seeking to achieve. And so that is a First Nation view to this legislation. Again, amendments are required, but we really should all be getting behind this because we're all a son, a daughter, a granddaughter, or perhaps have children of our own. And so if we do not do this right now, there are impacts that we may experience moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well put.
Got you on time. I'm good.
Yeah, well put. We'll go now to Mr. Jesse Zeman from the BC Wildlife Federation, who's online.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to be a witness. The BC Wildlife Federation is British Columbia's largest and oldest conservation organization with over 40 members and 100 clubs across the province. Our clubs and members spend hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours and dollars conducting wildlife, wetland, and fish habitat restoration, as well as advocating for legislative, regulatory, and policy changes to support a future that includes healthy fish, wildlife, and habitat. Over the past 2 years, in the world of fish, wildlife, habitat, water, and wetlands, the BCWF has delivered over 100 projects totaling worth more than $7 million, while partnering with over 50 Indigenous communities. This includes 71 beaver dam analogs built in 2024 and nearly 45,000 kilograms of garbage removed from the tidal marsh in the Fraser River. Since 2021, we've delivered over 230 projects and more than $11 million in project work for benefit of the environment. Our partners and funders include Indigenous communities, ENGOs, local communities, private landholders, Government of Canada, and the province of BC. Our 2016 estimate of volunteer contribution by our members was over 300,000 hours per year. I believe we greatly exceed that now. Our membership is dedicated to the conservation of fish, wildlife, and habitat, donating hours and dollars to science and on-the-ground stewardship. However, our membership is also extremely concerned about the future of public access to fish, wildlife, habitat, and nature in general. The BCWF is deeply concerned that Bill C-73 does not ensure a future in which Canadians can camp, hike, backpack, birdwatch, hunt, and fish sustainably. These sustainable lifestyles and sustainable recreation must be front and center for new land designations. This bill provides the Minister of Environment and Climate Change powers that do not include adequate parliamentary oversight. The bill talks about collaboration but does not ensure stakeholders or British Columbians will be consulted. And the bill provides authority to set aside public land and delegate control to unelected management authorities. Consultation includes provinces, Indigenous peoples of Canada, and an advisory committee. There is no stipulation as to the representation of the advisory committee. There are a number of examples where the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change has failed to consult and sometimes represent the public, including Caribou Recovery in Northeast BC, which has set a number of our communities back by decades, and a lack of leadership around ensuring public access for sustainable lifestyles and sustainable outdoor recreation around mechanisms to achieve 30 by 30 targets. We believe that protecting or connecting British Columbians and Canadians to nature is good for their mental and physical health, and that people connected to the land are people who will protect it. The BCWF supports increased conservation. However, there is significant concern that this comes at the expense of eliminating sustainable use and sustainable outdoor recreation. The BCWF has experienced this with the proposed South Okanagan-Similkameen National Park Reserve in the same area where our members have funded, donated, and volunteered for the largest and most collaborative mule deer research project in the province's history. Throughout this project, our members have assisted in capturing GPS collaring and doing mortality investigations on mule deer, as well as deploying and maintaining over 150 remote sensing trail cameras and reviewing millions of pictures. These same people are now being told by the Government of Canada that they do not want to see them hunting in their own backyard because it's being turned into a national park reserve. We have also experienced declarations of moratorium on licensed hunting through other federally derived conservation mechanisms. This bill does not give us comfort that British Columbians and Canadians will be able to enjoy and interact with nature in the same places in the same ways we can today. If Canadian families are out camping, hiking, backpacking, hunting, and fishing sustainably, the Government of Canada should be saying, this is great. We want more people and their kids off their screens and out connecting with nature. The Government of Canada should be encouraging and supporting sustainable lifestyles and sustainable outdoor recreation, and that should be recognized in this bill. To close, everyone needs to see themselves in our shared future. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zeman. I will go to Greenpeace Canada as represented by Mr. Stephen Hazel.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Stephen Hazel. I'm pleased to represent Greenpeace Canada today on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Thanks for the opportunity to appear. Greenpeace is an independent, not-for-profit organization that uses peaceful protest to work towards a greener, more peaceful world. My role is as a consultant on federal nature law and policy. Formerly, I was executive director to a number of national environmental and nature groups. I served as regulatory affairs director at the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and as adjunct professor of environmental law at Ottawa U. Greenpeace's overarching message is this: with amendments, Bill C-73 could be an important tool to hold Canada accountable to meet its international commitments to halt and reverse nature loss. Nature in Canada is in dire crisis. As of 2020, 873 species have been identified as critically imperiled. Highly endangered northern spotted owls have dwindled in number to just one female in the wild. Boreal caribou populations are in sharp decline across Canada's north. The population of endangered right whales has continued to decline in the past decade, despite efforts to reduce entanglements and vessel strikes. Overall, Canada has repeatedly fallen short in fulfilling our commitments to protect nature since the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity. Federal and provincial nature laws have been largely ineffective and poorly implemented. Canadians are now demanding a strong nature law. A Greenpeace petition now has almost 90,000 signatures. The landmark 2022 Global Biodiversity Framework, signed by 196 countries, is a tremendous opportunity for Canada to halt human-induced extinction of threatened species and protect 30% of terrestrial and marine areas. This can and must be achieved while respecting the principle of free, prior, and informed consent under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My colleague has talked about CNESE, the Canada Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, and implementation has shown that legally binding targets and plans do drive progress, in this case on climate. The same is true for nature. Accountability is required to ensure progress, and legislation is needed to ensure accountability. Bill C-73 does need strengthening. Greenpeace Canada strongly supports the amendments proposed by EcoJustice and West Coast Environmental Law in the previous panel. To highlight a few of these amendments, the Biodiversity Shield Amendment would support a whole-of-government approach that is critical to ensure consistency in Canada's nature protection efforts, so that you don't have one department saying one thing and another department doing something that is completely contrary to the other. That's what we mean by whole-of-government approaches. Amendments are also needed to ensure that the proposed advisory committee has a legislated mandate to ensure its independence and effectiveness. And for myself, I would say anglers, hunters, landowners, ranchers, they are all experts as well. They're the people who manage wildlife on their land. So I don't see any reason why you wouldn't have them on the advisory committee as well. And in fact, the Species Risk Advisory Committee did have anglers and hunters on that committee. So I don't know why we wouldn't do that again under this bill. In a country that's built on colonial resource extraction, Bill C-73 must also explicitly prioritize the rights and leadership of Indigenous peoples. Bill C-73 should also acknowledge that the rights of nature are inherent to the right to a healthy environment as currently proposed by the government in the draft implementation framework for the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Note that Bill C-73's accountability framework mandates federal action such as setting Canada-wide targets, but not action by provincial or territorial governments. Provinces and territories hold much, if not most, of the authority under Canada's Constitution to conserve and restore nature, so collaboration among the several levels of government is absolutely critical to meeting the overall national targets. So in conclusion, a strong Bill C-73 would signal true leadership in Canada and leadership internationally to halt and reverse nature loss. Thank you so much. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hazel. From Nature Canada, Mr. Akash Maharaj. Go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my thanks to the members of the committee for inviting me to contribute to your deliberations on Bill C-73. I'm Akash Maharaj, Head of Policy for Nature Canada, one of our country's oldest conservation institutions. Nature Canada rallies together more than 250,000 individual Canadians and a network of more than 1,200 organizations in every province and territory. To be direct, our world is currently enduring the 6th mass extinction in planetary history, the Anthropocene extinction. And unlike the 5 great dyings of past epochs, this one is driven not by natural catastrophes, but instead by human activity and in particular habitat destruction. Species are currently disappearing at 1,000 times the natural extinction rate, and nearly 30% of surviving species are threatened with extinctions. Bluntly, we are in the midst of the gravest extermination crisis of life on our planet since the end of the dinosaurs. And for this reason, Nature Canada's members are convinced that Canada has made the right decision in joining the Convention on Biological Diversity, and especially in committing to conserve our lands and waters. Canadians are not committed to international standards to please international institutions. We are committed to them for the good of Canadians, for the well-being and prosperity of Canadian communities, and to leave a better country for future generations of Canadians. However, a commitment is only as good as the acts that follow it. When Canadians describe a promise as being a political promise, we are rarely expressing our confidence that those promises will be kept. And this is why Nature Canada is enthusiastic about a Nature Accountability Act, a federal law that would bind the federal Environment Minister and compel him to keep his conservation and biodiversity promises to Canadians. Bill C-73, as it currently stands, is not that law. The only accountability in the current text is in its title. The bill directs the minister to set national targets, but it has no mechanism to ensure that his targets are meaningful. The bill encourages the minister to develop measures linked to those targets, but has no requirements that he actually meet any of his targets, and it levies no consequences if he fails to do so. In essence, the bill neither provides the minister with any powers he does not already hold, nor does it bind him to any outcomes. But it could do all that and more if the legislators in this room are willing to summon the determination to amend it. We ask you to make and consider the following amendments. In Section 4, make it explicit that the minister is accountable to Parliament and to Canadians, not only for developing a plan towards his target, but also for actually implementing that plan and meeting those targets. In Section 5, ensure that the minister's targets are tied to species abundance, distribution, extinction risk, and habitat quality, and informed by the assessment process conducted by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Species in Canada. In Section 6, bind the minister's reports to the new anti-greenwashing provisions of the Competition Act, provisions that prohibit entities from making false or misleading claims about the environmental benefits of their offerings. In Section 7, strengthen the mandate and independence of the new advisory committee so that if the minister chooses not to implement a committee recommendation, he will have a positive responsibility to report his reasons to Parliament. And in Section 9, include a statutory requirement that the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development conduct and publish independent audits on ministerial compliance with the Act. These amendments would make the Nature Accountability Act a law worthy of its name, and as importantly, it would reassert the role of parliamentarians as the guardians of our democracy. Across the world, democracies are in decline. They are not dying on the barricades in a noble struggle against tyrants. They are surrendering themselves willingly to demagogues and to authoritarians because their peoples have come to believe that public institutions are operating without effect and without accountability. I ask you to amend this bill to stand up for Canada's natural heritage and to stand up for our democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maharaj. We'll go to the 6-minute round. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start my questions with Mr. Zeman from the British Columbia Wildlife Federation. I want to thank him for his testimony and thank him and his members for the tremendous grassroots efforts that have been made to do on-the-ground work for the benefit of all British Columbians and all Canadians through protecting and doing habitat enhancement. Mr. Zeman, the previous witness on this, I'm assuming you saw Ms. Anna Johnson from the West Coast Environmental Law Association said that this law is a process law, and by that it does not actually impact anything on the ground. What's the BC Wildlife Federation's role in helping the government craft this legislation? Were you consulted prior to the development of this legislation? And because it's a process law, how does this help the BC Wildlife Federation actually deliver meaningful conservation programs on the ground, if at all?
Okay, first question was, thanks for the question, were you consulted on this law? No, to my knowledge, our organization was not. And the second question, how does this help? The challenge, quite frankly, that we're having out here is there is a lot of concern around federal mandates and federal funding for protected areas. Our organization, by and large, supports increased conservation measures. I think we demonstrated that when we talk about all the things that we do. Our challenge and the concern in BC is that British Columbians who go out camping, hiking, hunting, and fishing are going to be excluded from these places. And so, when you talk about outcomes for conservation, if you throw the conservationists out, you're in part throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think that's the broader challenge here is you need people who buy into the outcomes around conservation designations and who are there to support them and defend them as opposed to removing them from them.
The attempt in this legislation to be that of conservation or that of preservation?
It looks like preservation. We certainly, given our experiences over the last probably decade as it relates to the National Park Reserve and other discussions around the nature agreement, we don't see ourselves in this future for sure.
Okay. I want to talk about the access. What is the concern insofar as access in a preservation model? I used to be a national park warden. I used to be a conservation officer with the province of Alberta. I was a fisheries technician, and I worked on worked for the government of Alberta, worked for numerous conservation organizations when I, as Billy Joel said it, wore a younger man's clothes. But from your perspective as a federation, could you please tell me what the concerns of your members are when it comes to being able to practice conservation-type activities such as hunting and fishing, and differentiate that from the other activities insofar as access?
Yeah, so generally speaking, preservation is a hands-off approach, whereas conservation sees people as part of land management, part of wild management, or fish management. And so, for example, in the world of conservation, we talk about our projects. We were just down actually in the South Okanagan the other day, putting out a bunch more trail cameras where we're looking to do a prescribed and cultural burn, which is active land management. In the Okanagan, this is a fire-maintained ecosystem and a pile of it. 100 years ago, we started suppressing fire, and in the 1950s, we invented Smokey the Bear, who was a fraud, who said, put out forest fires. Well, what we're learning here is that forest fires and controlled and prescribed and cultural burns were a part of landscape management, and our ecosystems need fire to function. So that would be the difference between conservation and preservation, I guess, in this case.
I would agree with you. I think the people of Jasper fully understand now what the difference between preservation and a conservation model is, and what happens when you sterilize from human use and human activity vast tracts of land without active conservation and management. For example, the Jasper National Park did not do any wolf predation control, and have since basically lost the caribou herds that spent most or some of their life cycle inside Jasper National Park, yet everybody outside of Jasper National Park was blamed for that population declining. But the goal here, I think overall from the government and through the United Nations framework, the Convention on Biodiversity, is 30 by 2030, but it's also 50% by 2050. When I went to university, the model was 12.5, 75, 12.5, which is 12.5% of preservation, 75% of active management, and then 12.5% would be used by cities and so on. I don't imagine that anybody in any urban environment is going to be asked to tear down their house or to make way for nature. So who is going to be asked to cede their land, their territory? Because the question's been asked here about whether or not this would affect private land, but because it's a process bill, one could argue that the Species at Risk Act is a process bill, and yet it can very much impact a landowner. Can you tell us how the government would possibly get to 50% of the biozones in Canada without actually having an impact on privately owned land?
In 15 seconds, please.
No, in 15 seconds, the answer is no, I can't.
Okay. Patel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Of the Ottawa River here, over 2 years ago, we organized a mini or regional COP15, and I assembled over 70 community leaders, including the Indigenous Guardian of Kirigan-Zibi, because we wanted to ensure that the conservation efforts are locally grounded, effective, and equitable. From this gathering, we create something quite unique. The project is called Kiji Maninan, which means our canoe, and that means we all in it together. It's an Indigenous-led conservancy project. It involves over 40 municipalities and 10 organizations and industries altogether. We received $2 million from Environment Canada, and we launched this project this summer. This will make the Outaouais the first region in Canada to try to develop a roadmap to meet our biodiversity target. So my question for Chief Adamek, how Bill C-73 could mandate greater recognition, funding, and support for a similar Indigenous-led initiative across Canada?
No, merci pour la question. Certainement, moi.
Thanks for the question. I certainly believe that having a committee for the department would be a way to ensure that the responsible minister responsible for implementing that legislation would be accountable.
That within the legislation and the specifics around, as was mentioned, some of the accountability in terms of data collection, monitoring, and assessment. You know, you mentioned the One Canoe project, which I think is a great example. But certainly in the long term, how is that One Canoe project being tracked? What are the outcomes specifically? And, you know, as one of your colleagues on this committee shared in terms of, 2050 by 2050, ambitious, but in my view, not impossible. In fact, we see Indigenous and protected conserved areas, just like in the Yukon, the Cascadene Council, for those who are having side chatter and some laughs on the side, would really encourage you to take a look at the Cascadene and what they've done in terms of their Indigenous and protected and conserved area. So, I think that the goals, again, are ambitious, but we don't have another planet. There's no plan B. So the option here is to really lean in and work together to be able to advance and support First Nations-led, of course, conservation and biodiversity protection.
Thank you so much. And I would say from my experience, Indigenous-led biodiversity projects are very successful, and they have shown a great leadership. So I hope every region in Canada will follow examples like this. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Hazel. The minister spoke when he came about his openness to suggestion on how to improve Bill C-73. And I would like to, for you to mention, if you have time, 5 key amendments you would like to see.
5? Well,
I know there's more, but...
to get the 5 important ones, I think my colleagues in the previous panel have mentioned a few. I think the target setting, embedding target setting legally in the bill is important, because that's not there. That's one. Ensuring that the NBSAPs have some meat in the legislation on them, so they describe what the minister must do in terms of producing the NBSAP. That certainly is a second one. Thirdly, the advisory committee needs some amendments to ensure that it is independent and it can set its own mandate. And I just come back to the point I made earlier. I mean, I do think that we have to try and bridge this gap between stuff that happens in Ottawa and the solid conservation work that happens on the ground and in the water, whether by the Wildlife Federation representatives who have been mentioned or by Indigenous peoples. I think we've got to figure out how to bridge that gap. But this bill is a much smaller bill than what's been represented. It's really about accountability and about measuring progress. And I just don't see how we can be against that. Another amendment relates to the Commissioner for the Environment. I think it's important that the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development have the explicit authority under the legislation to conduct audits, as I guess it's a he now, it was a she, as he currently does now under the SNEEZY legislation.
Thank you. So if you haven't already included those recommendations in your brief, perhaps you could send them to us.
Yeah, they're all in the brief.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Hazel, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that Canada has not respected its own commitments. I will start from there and give you some quotes that we have been reading for the past weeks and months and even recent years in the media. For example, Ottawa is making sure that there is a petroleum boom. ExxonMobil is looking for to oil drill, and also Canada is allowing for petroleum to be present in protected areas. The minister said that there is no drilling, but in close to the water, but the government is authorizing drilling and forging in order to find some oil and if oil is found, then the protected status is removed. So C-73, if it were currently in place, do you think that this text would, as written now, would prevent the government from encouraging oil and gas in Newfoundland and measuring and removing protections? For my answer is no.
Has really nothing to do with oil and gas exploration, whether offshore or onshore. It just doesn't. It's just we have to come at these issues of oil and gas exploration and their impacts on nature using other laws, whether federal laws or provincial laws. But this bill really doesn't speak to that issue that you're identifying, if I've understood you correctly.
Therefore, right now, C-73 can't prevent anything in order to protect biodiversity, whether it's carbon mining or a further oil extraction. So the provinces are protecting forests, and the federal government is protecting the waters. There is a shared responsibility there. What does C-73 mean for various provinces, including Quebec, given that provinces retain most of their responsibility to manage their land ecosystems?
Vous avez raison.
You are correct.
This bill has been, I think, fairly carefully written so far, and our amendments are trying to do the same thing to ensure that that the obligations under the Act fall on the federal minister, and they do not fall on provinces. They don't really oblige provinces to do anything. I mean, given that the provinces have the substantial authority to legislate with respect to nature, given that responsibility, it's imperative that the provinces, territories, and Indigenous governments, get involved, and it's essential that they assist in terms of delivering on the targets that have been set nationally. But this really it doesn't. This is a much smaller bill than some are suggesting. This bill is really pretty limited to trying to figure out whether or not we're making progress on biodiversity. And unfortunately, there's a long history in this country of dissembling, of governments dissembling and pretending that we're making progress, and by writing the reports in such a way as to appear that there is progress when the science says nature is in decline across the board.
Oui, je suis pas mal d'accord avec la.
I certainly agree with your analysis. It seems that the Act is legislating on agreements that were international. In 2020, it was declared that Canada had not respected its own commitments during the convention.
Pourrait-elle garantir?
The C-73, as it is written, would it be able to ensure that long-term 2030 and 2050 targets are met from the Montreal Convention?
There's no guarantees. There's no guarantees there. In a way, if Bill C-73 is passed, it will be up to the nature community. It'll be the folks sitting at this table, the wildlife federations across the country. It'll be up to the Canadian public to look at the reports that are generated and say, how are we doing in terms of protecting southern resident orcas?
Thank you. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I have a number of questions for a few of the witnesses, but maybe I'll start with Mr. Hazel. You had mentioned a biodiversity shield in your opening remarks, but can you talk a little bit more about what that biodiversity shield would look like, and what the amendment that you're suggesting would mean in practice for federal decision making?
Thank you for the question. The three organizations, EcoJustice, West Coast Environmental Law, and Greenpeace, we had two ideas for this biodiversity shield. But the basic idea is that there be some communication among federal departments and agencies to ensure that nature and biodiversity is taken into account in all government decisions. Because unfortunately, the federal government's a big place, and lots of people are doing lots of different stuff, and a lot of that stuff is at cross purposes to one another. But this law would try to herd those cats, to try and ensure that whether or not it's Natural Resources Canada making a decision with some coal mine or some offshore oil and gas project, that nature is being considered in those decisions. So we had two suggestions. One was the most benign would be that departments must take into consideration nature and biodiversity in bringing forward proposals to cabinet. So that's the less dramatic of the two. The second one would be to put a positive obligation on them to ensure that that whatever decisions they make do not harm, that do not breach Canada's obligations under the Act or internationally. So that's a bit of a tougher swallow for the government, I guess. But we still think that they both would help.
Thanks so much. I asked this to the previous panel, but really thinking about Canada's slow progress when it comes to conservation, I have deep concerns about whether or not we're going to meet our targets of 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. Maybe starting with the three people in the room, yes or no, do you feel like Canada is on track to meet its nature commitments? And then I'd love to hear from each of you about, if this bill is not amended, whether you think that it has a realistic shot of getting us on track. So maybe starting, Mr. Hazel?
No, we're not on track. I think the bill will help, especially if we have amendments.
Thanks. And Mr. Maharaj?
No, we will not meet our targets. In addition to 30 by 30, there is a commitment to 25 by 25. 2025 arrives in 20 days, and we are at roughly 14%. We're not making up the other 11% in that time. Should the bill pass, even if it's not amended, there is no harm in doing so, but it would be a terrible missed opportunity. It would be an exercise in political communications rather than an exercise in public policy. And I think there is perhaps one downside, and that is that every time governments of any stripe make promises that they do not keep, it erodes public confidence in public institutions.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Adamek?
Maybe I'm the optimist here, but I do believe that we can achieve those goals if you work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. When you look at that 14%, a large amount of that 14% is with Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And so we must find ways to propel and support those communities, rights holders to the land. There were questions earlier around, would people have to leave their houses and trees are going to be planted? Okay, take a moment here. What we're talking about is, potentially fee simple land, but also crown lands. And most importantly, all lands, as we learned in the most recent Supreme Court case, is First Nation land or Inuit land or Métis land right across this country. And so if we are going to reach these targets, as the optimist at the table, it will only happen if you work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. And that has been made very clear, in my view, by the ways that the IPCAs have supported that 14% that we would love to see get bigger. With respect to your second part of the question, so have we reached them? No. Is there still time? In my view, and in AFN's view, there is still time, perhaps more the 30 by 30 as opposed to the 25 by 25. Look, if this bill doesn't pass, then all the work that's being done to achieve goals, and these goals aren't just, of course, Canada's goals.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I do want to have a follow-up question, and I think I've only got 30 seconds left.
Not even 10 seconds, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I will let you know my question, and I'll follow up in the next round.
Thank
I
you.
really wanted to get your perspective on how you see this bill working with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but I'll ask it in my next round.
Thank you so much. Alors, on va passer au deuxième tour et...
Now on to the second round. The way we worked during the first round of 2 minutes each worked pretty well. So we'll do the same thing because we're running a little bit late. Mr. Crown for 2 minutes.
So given the time constraints, Mr. Zeman, you didn't quite have time to answer the last question from my colleague, Mr. Calkins, about landowners. If you could be so kind as to submit that with a written submission, that would be very helpful.
Sorry, the question about 50 by 50?
That's right, yes.
Okay, we'll have to do some work on that. All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now, still with Mr. Zeman from the BC Wildlife Federation, the Premier of the Yukon Territory and the Territory's Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources have publicly expressed their support for a project to connect the Territory's power grid to BC's Site C hydro dam so the Territory can stop burning diesel. They've called this a generational investment and a nation-building moment. Mr. Zeman, can you speak to the effects of Bill C-73 to the future of major projects such as this?
Yeah, and sorry, I'm not aware of the connection to Site C or the plan from the Yukon down to BC. In the world of major projects, I think our focus is really around the world of conservation, and I think generally speaking, our message here is that Ottawa is not connected to people who live in the communities who are impacted or not impacted by conservation outcomes. I think that's kind of the message we're trying to get across. And I think everyone here should be cognizant of that. And when we talked about the National Park Reserve, where that's been introduced, it's been tremendous social conflict in all of the communities. Pre that, there were 44,000 hectares that had been acquired and restored by groups like Ducks Unlimited, Nature Trust, Nature Conservancy, hunters and anglers, and no one had an issue. So I think, what we're trying to get across here is that there's a big place called Ottawa, and it is out of touch with communities and people who have their hands in the ground and are working together, and that is one of the missing pieces in this bill.
Merci beaucoup. On passe maintenant, Monsieur Longfield pour...
Thank you. Now on to Mr. Longfield for 2 minutes.
And I'm going to focus my questions with Mr. Maharaj. And thank you for succinctly addressing each section that you had some comments on. I wanted to circle back on a couple of the sections, if I might. The section 9 on audits. Mr. Hazel also mentioned the involvement of the Commissioner of Sustainable Development and Climate Change being involved in the audit process. Is that something you were thinking there, having that come through Parliament or back to Parliament or through this committee?
Absolutely. No person can be a dispassionate judge of his or her own desert. Right. Any minister of any stripe is always going to tell a good story about their achievements. The auditor has no such restrictions, and it must come back to Parliament.
Yeah, thank you. And he makes us uncomfortable, and that's his job. But he's always at our committee. I think he's been here 6 times in the last couple of months. Also on the assessment, section 5 on the assessment process, I'm thinking of the University of Guelph. I think about them a lot, no surprise, being the member of Parliament from Guelph, but they have the Biodiversity Institute that's been tracking biodiversity loss of animal as well as plant life forms across the planet. Getting data from universities, including, let's say, the University of Guelph, is that what you're thinking in terms of assessment, of getting third-party assessments done?
Yes, by universities, by expert groups, and by the Government of Canada's own committees and facilities. It is an extraordinary matter that there is so much expertise within the government itself, which is not represented in the bill.
Great, thank you. And in the few seconds I have left, Chief Adamek, thank you. Your optimism is something we need more of, but we also need the accountability, and I think you hit a perfect balance there. So thank you for being at our committee.
Merci, Monsieur Longfield. Madame Posé.
Thank you, Mr. Longfield. On to Ms. Posé. I have a question for Mr. Hazel, and I'd like to talk about funding. What investments would be necessary in order to respect Canada's commitments to biodiversity and nature?
We need funding to deliver on this bill, but also to deliver on the ENVI SAPs, the action plans, so that we can provide support to Indigenous nations for the Indigenous protected areas, but also to support the work of local folks, the anglers, the hunters, etc., who are doing good work on the ground. So there needs to be that program. There is a major concern about funding winding up in this fiscal year. So this next budget has got to have significant new funding for nature in order to meet the targets that Canada has agreed to. And remember, Canada championed this, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Canada was hailed around the world for the work that we did in getting this deal done. Greenpeace International thanked the Prime Minister and the Minister of Environment for the work that they did. Now we've got to deliver.
Oui, bien, j'allais effectivement vous.
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. The government did well in Montreal, but this week we heard that there would be impact report on a carbon mining. I wonder how we might meet the targets that we have set for ourselves, be it they biodiversity or anything else. 10 seconds, Mr. Hazel, if you'd like to answer.
The answer lies with another federal law, the Impact Assessment Act, and making sure that big projects are subject to federal assessments.
Parfait, merci. Madame Collins.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up with Chief Adamek, as you mentioned, Indigenous protected areas make up a huge part of the progress that has been made when it comes to protecting nature in Canada. And Indigenous guardians are such an inspiring example of how conservation can be done in line with upholding Indigenous rights. You rightly raised the importance of having First Nations and Inuit and Métis governments at the table. I'm curious if there are other ways that you see this bill interacting with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how to make sure that, those voices and perspectives of different nations across Canada are heard and respected.
Thank you. We do want to acknowledge there are positive steps by which the legislation is referenced, but there are elements of UNDRIP that need to be further included in the bill, and specifically what I referred to in my opening remarks, which was the Ministerial Advisory Committee. And there are other elements of this legislation that does require direct correlation with UNDRIP. As we know, the right approach is a rights-based approach. And just lastly, I think it's important to remind ourselves that any major project, as was mentioned, must go through the Impact Assessment Act. This bill, Member Cram, is not related. This bill specifically is looking to ensure that we are keeping on track of our targets with respect to conservation. And so being from the Yukon, important that I do share that, of course, the impacts to that project with respect to this legislation is zero. It would be then rather directed to the IAA.
Okay. Time is more or less up, Ms. Collins. Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel, 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, to everybody who is here, to all of our witnesses. Welcome to your parliament, Mr. Maharaj. We had the pleasure of meeting yesterday, so hello. In your opening remarks, you talked about the public's trust, which can be eroded if we have a lot of announcements, but we don't actually have any results. Recently, we learned about the Net Zero Accelerator, which aims to meet targets as quickly as possible, the targets set for 2050. But 3/4 of those projects don't have a target, and we're talking about $8 billion that have been invested in various companies, but we don't actually have any targets. Do you think that this kind of management of public funds, which has a good objective, which is to reduce emissions, is undermining the efforts of the government?
That is obviously beyond the scope of C73, but I understand that you're asking it as an analogy about governments keeping their promises and being sound stewards of public funds in environmental projects. So clearly not. When governments miss their targets or handle public funds in a way that falls short of what they said, it damages public expectations and it damages public support for those very programs. But I would say that the remedy to that are more robust parliamentary investigations, actions, and raising these matters to public attention. Ultimately, a sound conservation strategy will win public confidence. Canadians believe in and support conservation, and to the extent that you can reward the government when it does well and punish them when it does poorly, you will be doing a service for our country.
Qu'est-ce qui est le plus efficace selon vous d'avoir?
What's better for you, in your opinion? Have a project that really targets the reduction of pollution, or having ambitious targets over many, many years with percentages that are based on, targets, data from 30 years ago? What do you think is the better solution? Very quickly.
Better to have modest promises that you keep rather than ambitious promises that you do not.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our expert witnesses for joining us today and sharing with us your insights. I wish we had more time. I wish we had more meetings, and I wish we started a couple of months ago, but sadly, opposition parties filibustered my motion to bring this pre-study forward to this committee. But I'm glad that we're here. Unfortunately, we've seen some Conservative witnesses do a little bit of fear-mongering with respect to their concerns around private land and hunting rights. I feel as though those concerns have been more or less debunked by experts who know how this legislation works. I'm from Ontario, and we're fortunate in Ontario to have legislation on conservation authorities. Unfortunately, recently the provincial government has been undermining some of the abilities of our conservation authorities to do their important work. But if this bill was passed, clearly it wouldn't prevent provinces from exercising their rights and doing what they would like. But I would like to know, from your perspective, both provincially and territorially, what steps would you believe are necessary to be taken in order to ensure that all groups continue to do their good work? If I could start with Ms. Adamek and then go to Mr. Maharaj, if that's possible.
I first want to acknowledge again that I did open in my opening comments noting the heightened political tensions that exist. And if we could all just take a moment to sort of put those aside, this bill, with respect to your question, is to make sure that whichever government is elected moving forward, that there is accountability to ensure that we are advancing with conservation. I truly feel, political stripes aside, that this bill is in the interest of all Canadians. There need to be amendments, absolutely. But if we don't have accountability for public funds with respect to advancing this work, then why are we even bothering with conservation at all? It is, and I recognize that there's time, but in the place that I come from in the Yukon, you finish the conversation because it is important to hear the voices. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I acknowledge this is your process. I come from a different process, one that is Clinget, and you talk until the work is done. So if I have a chance to come back, I will answer the rest of your questions. Thank you.
Well, I think the process is dovetailed. I think we had a good discussion, and I want to thank. We had a good discussion because of the the quality of the witnesses and the quality of the questions that were asked of them. So I want to thank the witnesses, especially those who traveled to be here, and this has been very informative. I found it very stimulating, and we'll be ready when the bill comes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Chair?
Yes.
What are we doing Monday?
We're doing instructions to the to the guidance to the analysts for the sustainable development study report. I want to keep working on the draft report from the appearances of the oil company CEOs. There's also the possibility of looking at the report on the caribou. There'll be an opportunity for members to present motions. So it's going to be more of a housekeeping kind of meeting.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask, because the caribou report, there's a time limit, it's time sensitive due to the decree, the public consultation, to my understanding, is already over. I think it would be wise for our committee to ensure that we contribute, if we spent that much time as a committee reviewing it, that be the top priority to make sure that we can contribute to that process.
Yeah, what I would suggest is you bring both reports, and we can decide on the spot. Because I don't think we have time for a debate, but bring both reports and we can talk about it. Yes, somebody had their hand up? Who? Ms. Collins.
And I'm sorry, I just missed the very beginning of, you're talking about the agenda for Monday, and just wanted to make sure that...
feel free to leave the table. Yes, go ahead, Ms. Collins, sorry.
Just for the agenda for Monday, just wanted to make people aware, but also flag for the chair, if you're doing up an agenda, that I will be moving the motion on the net zero accelerator to get further on redactions.
Yeah, thank you. No, as I say, it's pretty flexible at the moment. But I guess the main point is we're not having witnesses. We're not having witnesses on a particular topic. It's going to be an in-camera meeting on basically committee business. Yes, Mr.
Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
You had something else? Ms.
Interrupted, but I think I still have the floor.
Go ahead.
Just that I'm also intending to table my energy poverty motion and also have a discussion about reporting to the House. And so just wanted to flag for you and for the committee if there is a agenda being made up.
Thanks very much.
Just so Ms. Collins knows, the Conservatives will be supporting the 360 pages that are ripped out of the net zero accelerator contracts.
Well, we can talk about that on Monday. In the meantime, I wish you all a very good rest of the day and a good weekend.